What up, HSM? It's your boy, Nico Pizzarello, coming to you from the beautiful green room at Benttree, here to dive into Mark chapter 13 with you guys. I am so excited to dive into this text, but I gotta be honest with you guys. In reading this text, it hit me kind of funky. It hit me in a way that text hasn't really hit me in a long time, where I found myself overwhelmed with the magnitude of what's happening in the text. And so humbled at my recognizing the little understanding I actually had of this text. It sounds counterintuitive, but really I found myself really like metaphorically on my knees saying like, Lord, I feel like I only have a fraction of this. I only understand a little piece of this text, not enough to communicate it. And aside from Mark 13 altogether, I learned a beautiful lesson in the studying process of this, that the Lord has no ceiling, that I can't go to Criswell and be a biblical studies major for however many years and all of a sudden have a good grip on the Bible. It doesn't work like that. So I'm thankful for what the Lord has shown me in this time. And enough about me. Let's get on to the text, shall we? Before we dive in, there's a term that we're going to talk about a lot in reference to this text. It's the term eschatology. Eschatology comes from the Latin word eschaton and ology, or the two. I'm not an English major. It's made up of the word eschaton and ology, right? I don't know what language they are. Who cares? Eschaton means the end times or the last times, and ology means study, right? So eschatology is the study of the end times. We're going to dive into that a lot. What's fascinating about this text and the conclusion I came to after what I just kind of shared with you guys about my understanding of it made me think of a time when my fiance, who wants me to live a long and healthy life, made me a smoothie. A smoothie. This smoothie was very interesting because I didn't look when she made it, right? I couldn't look. She told me what was going in to the smoothie, but that's all I knew. That's all I wanted to know. Because if I knew anything else, I wouldn't eat it. Because I have this stupid block in my brain where if I see food and I think I don't know it, I won't eat it. So I told her. She told me what was in it. She made it, and then she handed it to me. And man, I took a swig of this thing, and all of a sudden I'm like, this girl went to like chef school. Like, what'd she live in France for 10 years? Like, why is this thing so delicious? It was beyond my comprehending. It was beyond my understanding. The thing was so good. And since that day, I've had like 1,000 of those smoothies because they're so freaking healthy and they're so delicious. But in that taste, it tasted so complex. It was such an experience just tasting it that I was like, there's no way this thing is like of this world. Like, I think like Jesus descended to make this smoothie and then he went back up without anybody noticing. That's what I kind of felt like in a totally not heretical way. But then the next time she made it, I asked if I could watch. And when I watched the smoothie, I saw that the process of making the smoothie was actually very basic. It was very simple. All she did was take these ingredients and put it in and blended it and then gave it to me. That's it. And it was basic ingredients. It was like strawberries and blueberries and like orange juice, bananas, stuff like that, right? Spinach and kale, all that kind of stuff. But there was no big secret to it. It was complex, but really at its core, it was simple. And I think this text is the same way, in that what Jesus is how he's presenting his information and what he's saying, while simple in its essence, will be interpreted by us as complex. But at the end of the day, his application, his point in saying it all, is very, very simple. So, let us dive in. We'll break this text down into really like 3.5 areas. Before the coming of the Son of Man, the actual coming of the Son of Man, and then our response to the coming of the Son of Man, right? So, let's start at the top. We see Jesus and his boys leaving the temple, and one of his dogs, say, "Hey, that's a really like huge stone over there. Jesus, isn't that sweet?" They're literally just describing an attribute of the temple, and Jesus' response is that the temple will be destroyed. So that's like if you left the Benttree parking lot on Sunday and you're like, man, that's a cool little like awning thing like over the crossing, and then someone was like, actually, that's going to get destroyed. You'd be like, what? Hang on, like that's not a proportional response, right? But what's fascinating is the way that Jesus says it's going to get destroyed. He uses language that reflects Haggai. The book of Haggai in the Old Testament, chapter 2, verses 15 through 16, when the temple's actually being built. So he uses the same language as the way it was being built to describe that it is going to get turned down. It's very interesting. Then he responds with two negatives. Not a double negative, which would cancel out and be a positive, but two negatives. See, this is very intentionally emphatic. In Greek, this is one of the most emphatic things you can actually do, is this use of two negatives, right? So with this destruction, it's implicitly understood that with this destruction that Jesus is talking about, bad things are coming for believers, right? So we hear that. We think bad things are coming for the believers, but what we know about the book of Mark and doing this online series is that the book of Mark is about the disciples. So that's the framework of the book, and now we're about to talk about suffering. So how do those two go hand in hand? We'll get to that. But that's kind of the main question we're going to be talking about here, right? We will focus on that further as we keep reading down into what Jesus' dialogue with his disciples. We see verse chapter 4. I do that every time. I told you. Verse 4. His boys ask him privately, it says at the end of verse 3, tell us, when will these things happen? And what are the signs? What are the signs that they are about to be fulfilled, right? This language is similar in and of itself, whether intentional or not, by the disciples. It's intentionally similar to the language of Daniel chapter 12, is it verse 7, where it talks about the Son of Man. So the disciples are starting to hone in. They're starting to key in, and they're starting to go with Jesus in this direction that he's sending them, based on his response of the temple being destroyed. Right? Further, Daniel 11:36 through 12:1. My phone, I didn't put it on vibrate. I'm sorry, guys. Through 12:1 talks about the arrival of the Antichrist and this great tribulation. Right? So the disciples, insofar as alluding back to Daniel 12. Know what they're actually alluding to. They know that this is a bigger thing that's happening right now, right? So then Jesus' language shifts, right? He very intentionally shifts to oppressive vernacular, right? In verses 5 through 8, right? He talks about birth pains. He talks about personal suffering. He talks about persecution, tribulation. This is for followers everywhere, right? This is, if you will, a broad stroke of what's to come during this time of tribulation. And then, in verses 9 through 13, he gets personal. He goes inner circle, right? He talks to the dogs, right? These are my boys. And this message he gives them is for them, right? So let's look at that a little bit, right? In chapter 13, verse 9. He switches. He says, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to local councils and authorities, right? And now, on the backside of this, we know that the same truths apply for us, but in this time it was spoken specifically for the apostles, right? So what he's doing in this talk intentionally to the disciples and partially in his broader stroke is he's demonstrating a correlation between persecution and the spread of the gospel. Almost like persecution is the handing off of a baton, if you will, to the spreading of the gospel. And then in verse 11, he brings all of this together, right, with the means, right? How are you guys going to do this? In the midst of dark oppression, how are you going to get through this suffering, this persecution? And the piece of this puzzle that's been missing all along is revealed in verse 11 in him saying it is the Holy Spirit and the promise of what's to come. It's the Holy Spirit. So now, as we keep going, we find ourselves in verse 14, where this strange term comes up, a very emphatic term, the abomination of desolation. Interesting, right? That sounds like something we don't really want anything to do with, nothing we want any part of. But to the ancient audience, this would have been a very recognizable term, and it would actually be a signal for fleeing. The type of fleeing where if you didn't begin fleeing in this exact second, you probably weren't going to make it. It's too late, right? This whole text is emphatic language, but this terminology, it would not have gotten overlooked. And if anyone was half listening, they would have woken up to this. This is a big deal. Seriously, it is very much, if you don't start moving now, you might not make it, right? And so Jesus is saying, he's using this language and this attention grabbing to say that the temple is not holy, that the temple is actually going to get destroyed. But the purpose of this text is to show the contrast between this Old Testament that's going to get destroyed and the believers, right? the believers survive even though the temple gets demolished, right? And so as we keep reading in verse 19 and 20, we see very similar language yet again to Daniel 12, verse 1, right? Jesus is aligning himself exclusively with the Old Testament law. He's not an anarchist, and he's not this new guy, new player on the field, right, that needs to get attention. No, he's saying, I'm the fulfillment of the things that you've already known. He's saying, you've heard about me. You've heard these laws. You've heard these words speaking. What I'm telling you now should be ringing bells in my referencing them. He's saying, I'm the fruition of all of that. All of that has come to fruition through me, and or will come to fruition through me. Very important to know. And then in verse 19 and 20, we see Mark talk about salvation in the end for believers, right? And this being the promise, right? This being the crux of this whole text. And we'll get to that a little bit in the response to the coming of the Son of Man. But for now, let's talk about the actual coming of the Son of Man, right? So far, there's been no mention of the temple or the original comments or questions made by the apostles, right? So they asked a question, and essentially Jesus has, in their mind, gone off on a tangent, right? It's a relevant tangent. It's kind of cool, but it's still a tangent nonetheless, right? It's important, and that's interesting, because what Jesus does as he keeps moving forward in this talk that he's giving his disciples, or sermon, if you will, verse 24 through 27, is he makes this cosmic, right? He's not talking about Israel. He's not talking about Jerusalem. He's not talking about a 12-acre square of land. No, he's taking it much, much broader. He's saying this is a cosmic conversation that we're having. This is not geographically bound. This is huge, right? And all of this language that he uses in 24 through 27 is language echoed in the Old Testament. This is so similar, it's not even funny. It's all but directly quoting stuff in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, Micah, and Haggai. This is crazy. So this is all of this further affirms Jesus' imagery of eschatology, of the eschatological times, right? And all of these references of what's to come, of the age to come, of the Son of Man, Jesus is referencing all of those here in Mark 13. And it's pretty powerful, especially when we get to verse 27, and he brings it back to the disciples. So in verse 27, when he brings it back to his disciples, he changes the game. He says for the reward, he talks about the reward for their faithfulness. This reward is being reunited with him. That's insane, right? Because we've already talked about crazy amounts of suffering, crazy amounts of pain and tribulation, and he's saying the reward for all of that is being reunited with him. And we know that the exact same is true for us. That through tribulation, through birth pains, through persecution, through the difficulty, both physically and emotionally, that we experience in this life, we await Jesus' return eagerly, because he told us that is the reward for our faithfulness, that's what we have to look forward to, that's where we turn our eyes, that's where we turn our focus. His return and his present dwelling of the Spirit are what sustain us and what get us to the other side of glory. Before we get to the last section here, let us not brush over one more Old Testament flashback, if you will, where Jesus mentions bringing all of the believers, he says the elect. He's bringing all of the elect back to himself. This is not the first time that God would take his exiled people that are scattered all over the nations and reunite them back to himself. This is a reference to the exile. This is a reference to all sorts of oppression that we see in the Old Testament. All sorts of oppression. It's another Old Testament flashback. And yet another time that Jesus is aligning himself with the words of the Old Testament to show his validity. And then to us, as we read with hindsight, show his knowledge and show his wisdom and show his passion and just show his validity overall. Response to the coming of the Son of Man. Mark 13:28 through 37. Note that the reader and the disciples are still in the dark on the timeline, which was the original question. You see, when we read something, especially in the Bible, more often than not, when we do read something, we read it with hindsight. And so we know things that the disciple and the original reader wouldn't have known, right? Because we're so 2,000 plus years removed from it. But we still don't know the answer to this, right? That's very intentional. Very, very, very intentional, because that's not what matters, right? The disciples are to be alert and to be faithful. That's what matters. And that's what Mark's showing in this text. That's what Mark's showing in his structure. And that's what Mark's showing in his resolve. They should be prepared for the bad stuff. They really should. The disciples should, and so should we. That's what matters in this text. That's what Jesus is answering. That's what Jesus is pointing to, is that we should be ready for the tribulation. For the manifestation of the Antichrist himself, we should be ready for the crap that comes our way. And the metaphorical destruction of the temple, because we know, actually, the physical, in that day, physical destruction of the temple, and in this day, what we would look to as the destruction of the temple. But we know that in the destruction of the temple, that same temple was rebuilt, right? It was replaced and exceeded with this metaphorical stone of Jesus, which the chapter before this, chapter 12, named as the cornerstone of this new temple, right? See, this isn't while this is the end of the old way, this is still the same way. This is the fulfillment of that old way and the establishment of the new way. This last section of Mark 13, we'll go through real quick, and we will be on our way tonight. It's the parable of the doorkeeper. And I would argue that the parable of the doorkeeper is our call. It's to stay awake. It's to sit by the door so that we can see when he comes back, so that we can be prepared when he comes back. And that process of staying awake and seeing, that is our active faithfulness to the call that Jesus gives us. See, Jesus, in chapter 12 and now moving into chapter 13, has switched his vernacular to be very, very emphatic. Where it used to be more passive, now it is very emphatic. His verb structure is very intently that of be alert, watch out, stay awake, pray. Be alert, stay awake. It's very, very, very driven and direct. And that's on purpose. And that comes to a climax, comes to fruition, not to a fruition, but that the point is reached its fullness here in this talking about the doorkeeper. And this, my friend, changes everything. This changes the motive and the intent in which we view Mark 13. Because Jesus has assured us that in the midst of trouble, he will return. He will summon all believers from every corner of the earth, and he will bring them back to himself. And guys, that is our hope, right? And the most beautiful thing is, until he comes and does that, he has given us his Spirit. And in his Spirit, he indwells us now. So he gives us the power to get to that day. To give us the power to be faithful, to be alert, and to follow and live out the call that Jesus gives us here in Mark chapter 13. I love you guys so much. So much. You have no idea. And I cannot wait to tune in tomorrow as our boy DP takes us to chapter 14 as we begin winding down the story of Mark. Love you guys. Have a good night.